Well, Christy, as you know, it is Mental Health Awareness Month. And so we wanted to bring you on because you have a powerful story. You work with people specifically when it comes to trauma. So we just want to spend a little time just talking through trauma and its effects and a little bit of maybe even somebody who would get on that just needs some help identifying that, yes, that's me. Maybe it's somebody who knows someone in their, in their relationships that are just walking through it. We just want to spend a little time. So I'm going to just invite you to just share a little bit of your story and where the Lord has showed you, taught you, opened you up, not only to the fact that that is a part of your story, but then also how can we step in and get the kind of help and take steps forward. So
Well, childhood, there was definitely some trauma there. But when I really started to understand trauma was after we adopted our daughter from Ethiopia. About a year and a half in, she started having some pretty significant struggles, and I won't go into the detail today, but it was pretty severe, and we were just desperate to help her. And we tried so many things. We prayed and we fasted and we had our elders come over and lay hands on her and pray for her. And we went to so many therapists and doctors, and we really weren't seeing much help, and we were feeling hopeless. And during that time, I started noticing just my own triggers of unresolved stuff in my own life, of just feeling not good enough, feeling like a failure. At the same time, my husband was struggling on and off with substance abuse. We were planning a church, and it was just a really, really hard journey. I started volunteering around that time in Atlanta. We were in Atlanta, Georgia, with a ministry that was serving human trafficking survivors that had become homeless because they had gotten pregnant. And as I began just hearing their stories and of just what led them to where they were, what I continued to hear over and over was just childhood trauma, histories of sexual abuse and physical abuse and foster care and household dysfunction. And I can remember just, calling out to God, what can we do about this? Because, my husband and I had worked for many years with vulnerable populations and jumping in once they were in trafficking or once they were homeless or incarcerated, which is all great stuff. But what can we do to really get to the root of that? And then I just started learning about trauma. I went back to school and got my master's in clinical mental health therapy with a specialty in trauma. And just learning the research of just how, the more adversity that you have, the more trauma you have between birth and 18, the more likely you are to become an addict, to be homeless, to commit suicide, to have mental health issues like depression, anxiety, and mood disorder, as well as physical health. And that was something that was just really surprising to me. And then when I learned that, connection and relationship, like God designed us to live in community and connection, authentic community, not fake community, which I think us Americans are familiar with, but authentic community with one another, that can really reverse the damage that is done due to trauma. So once I learned that, I feel like the Lord just lit a fire in my heart to just share that with other people, to help other people. And even though, my own trauma story wasn't over, because there were still some traumatic things that I went through, just the Lord just lit that fire in me to really help others and then also begin my own healing journey.
I love that. Even as I'm listening, you immediately dove in, and it wasn't until you saw a few things pop out in daughter, even people around you, you started recognizing, wait a minute, this is my thing, which is a very, trauma people, and you would know this better than me, tend to think, they don't think of themselves very much. They don't recognize what's going on themselves until much later. And so how does, somebody might be on here thinking, is it even okay to say I'm a trauma victim? Am I like, even that word victim for me, I've had a traumatic experience, again, probably not going to share here, but it wasn't until later that I was able to just say, yeah, I have had a traumatic event. So it took me long enough to even say it was trauma, because I didn't want to call it that, because there's a lot of things that meant.
Mm-hmm.
But now what do I do? I'm not you. I don't have a PhD.
Mm-hmm.
I'm stuck.
Yeah.
And now I have it, but what's that mean?
Mm-hmm.
Where do I start?
Mm-hmm.
How do I even take steps forward? Because I start recognizing these patterns. And I just thought it was always like that, and that's just the way it is. But one of the things you talk about is getting to the root. So walk me through a little bit. I'm a new person. I'm coming to you for the very first time. I'm like, hey, I think I keep stumbling through the things I'm stumbling through because I have some trauma in my past.
Mm-hmm.
Where do I go, Christy? What do I do? What is there? Can you walk me through that a little bit?
Absolutely. And, it's hard. I think the first step, and at least for me in my journey and what I've seen and so many people that I've walked with, the first step of just admitting that trauma has manifested in your life in such a way that it's impacting your life negatively. And that's hard. It's hard to
Can I even
admit.
say, I'm listening to your story. You're planning a church, you're adopting kids, and it's not until even a little bit later that you're like, oh, but by the way, I might have some trauma in my life.
Yeah.
And I feel that with people. I feel like there's a lot of people that it takes some time to even be able to say that. Why is that?
Mhm. Yeah, I think there's shame
Yeah.
in it. I also think one of the things that the Lord has really laid on my heart is how oftentimes, when we experience trauma, and especially in childhood,
Mm.
it often allows the enemy kind of an open door to start speaking lies about who we are, about our identity in Christ, about our future. And we have these thoughts that often start in childhood and they continue. And so just admitting that we have these things, sometimes trauma manifests in what our culture would say are small sins, and others in bigger, like culturally. And there's shame there. And I think too, we're not used to being authentic. And to admit that we have a problem is to admit weakness. And for so long in my journey as a pastor's wife, who could I tell? Who could I share what was going on? Who could I trust? And if I did share, then what would that mean? What would that mean for me? What would that mean for our family? What would people think of me? What would people think of my husband? Even what would people think of God? So I think there's shame. I think for me specifically, there was pride.
Yeah.
There was a lot of what will people think? And for so long, I pushed down and I suppressed my feelings. And one of the things I talk about a lot is just the illustration of, what happens when you take a beach ball and you're in the water and you push it down. Eventually, you can hold it down for a little while, right? But eventually that beach ball is going to come up and it's going to splash all over you. And not only all over you, but those that are closest to you. And that's what trauma does. And often there's just so much shame in that. But one thing that I love about Jesus is that he meets us right where we are, and when the world may look at us and all they see is the manifestation of our trauma or the big sin, God sees our heart and he sees the trials that we've went through. And I think what I would say to someone is something that I say all the time, and that is, trauma is not your fault, but healing is your responsibility. you know, and that's a hard first step because admitting is often the hardest part.
Yeah, because I'm sitting here, even when you said there's shame, and I'm like, yes, but even, and tell me if this is right or not, but with people who have been through trauma, and I have a limited experience personally, but then also friends. Traumatic people have had a traumatic experience, and then they have to figure out how to be strong. And a lot of times they have to do that on their own. And so they're like, I just have to, saying that have trauma is almost going backwards. It's like you've got to tackle the world and you've got to move forward and you've got to, but then you see these cracks. And so like you said, number one is just admitting it is hard. It's hard because you've been trying to do this on your own and get things together. And some of that even leads to, like you said, pride that it can pop out in all kinds of weird ways. But then once I finally go, no, I had a traumatic experience, or I'm a trauma survivor, and that is a thing, and I need to come to grips with that. Once I get there, where do I go now?
Yeah.
Because now I know it's there, and I'm ready
Right.
to admit it.
Yeah.
But now what do I do?
Yeah. I think reaching out,
Mm.
even if it's just one person. And that was hard for me, and it took a really, really long time to even find, for me, that one person that I can trust. And if you don't have that one person, finding a counselor. And I think that's one of the ways, and we may talk about this a little more later, but one of the ways that the church can help is collaborating with mental health professionals. Because for so long, my husband and I were both in ministry. We don't have a huge budget, and counseling is not cheap, and so often that was.
I think that's most people.
Yeah.
I mean, even if you have money, it's spent.
Yes.
Like that's just the American
Absolutely.
world. That's most of our world.
And counseling is expensive, so often I would be like, I know I need to talk to someone about this. I know I need to see someone. Like I'm seeing all these things that are coming out in me, but it was expensive, to be able to see someone. So I would say, first is reaching out to someone, getting help from a counselor, talking to your pastor, ministry leader. I think that's the first step. And then they are trained in how they can help move you forward.
Yeah. That's good. It's hard to do that because for a trauma person, you feel like, well, this isn't everybody else's world, and it's one thing to share some. People are used to sharing a little. They're not used to, and not a lot of toleration for. And I think a trauma person knows that because as they start unpacking their story, the moment it gets to be too much, they see it in another person. And that's where they're like, oh, you're not my person. And so, to unpack your whole story feels like, good night, how much time do we have? It's a lot. It's a very complicated. And so trust is hard. So finding that person and really reaching out, and making sure they're a trustworthy person, especially maybe even a counselor. And a lot of people are like, I don't have the money, but some things are worth investing in. And so, what have you seen? So I unpack my story. Are there some anchors that have been just helpful for you personally in terms of some new rhythms or some new, like, what are some things you've had to face? Walk me through a little bit of what you've encountered personally that's just helped you, not as a pastor's wife, not as but just as a woman who's just been through something that you shouldn't have been through, but you were. Give me some of those anchors of what you've learned that's really helped you move forward.
Yeah, I think, I'm still in therapy regularly. I actually just finished a trauma intensive with a therapist, which was very hard. And one of the aha moments that I had, as I was just unpacking with her, just some feelings that I was having in some of my relationships. And she said, you're not letting people see all of you. You only let them see part of you, which is a what trauma survivors do. We learn to compartmentalize and put on a happy face and act like things are fine. And we're used to often being the strong one. And she said, so you're not letting people love all of you.
Yeah, that's good.
They're only loving what you're allowing them to see. And so that's one of the biggest things right now in my life that I'm working on, is just being able to show up fully authentically myself. And that doesn't mean that I have to tell every detail of my story to every single person. But it does mean that I can be authentic wherever I go. And some other things that have been really helpful for me, one is just pouring my pain out to God, lamenting. You know, we see that in the Psalms. We obviously see that in Lamentations, of just, pouring our pain out. And it's okay at times to be angry at God. It's okay to ask why. How many times I've said, God, how much longer? And just asking for his help and trusting that he has a plan, that he's already went before us. Lamenting has been really big for me. Forgiveness, huge.
Yeah.
I often thought of forgiveness as just a one-time thing. You forgive and then you're done. And then even if, you think of whatever that hurt is, or whoever that is that hurt you, and even if you're still feeling those feelings of anger, of bitterness, well, I've already forgiven them. But just, it's a process of continuing to forgive every day when that person or that event comes up, asking God, I forgive them, and just releasing that, because if without forgiveness, it almost poisons you, And so that has been a really big part of my journey, as well as just getting healthy physically. The last, I would say, 4 or 5 years specifically have been challenging. And I noticed that, I started having physical issues. I wasn't able to sleep. I had adrenal fatigue from all the stress that led to a hormone imbalance, that led to short-term memory issues, that led to some depression. And being able to, like you said, create healthier rhythms around work and rest, as well as healthy boundaries. And that is something
Which again is a little hard for a trauma person.
Yes, that's something that has been super hard for me, because the way that I was always taught in ministry growing up is you just go, go, go. And you just serve everyone in front of you all the time, and no matter what. And I learned that just isn't healthy, and that we can't fix people. We can't save people. That is God. That we can be present with them, that we can love them, that we can pray for them, but it's not our job to fix and to save, and that we can't work harder at their healing than they're willing to work themselves. And so I've learned that boundaries are so important, that Sabbath is so important, and that's something that I didn't start doing up until the last couple of years, that rest is important. And so those are the big things that have been helpful for me on my journey.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Well, we really appreciate not only your story and your honesty and your wisdom, but also just appreciate that you pour your life out to really help people walk through their trauma, and you're really good at it. So very grateful for you.
Thank you, Matt.
Yeah.
Happy to be here.
Mm-hmm.